Dear Jordan, I want to talk to you about your recent video about Bill C-16. Let me begin with something on which we can agree. Where the wording of the law mentions an impact on someone of a speech act, quote, whether intentional or not, I fully agree that the wording is objectionable. The phrase potential or actual, intentional or unintentional, whether or not a complaint is made, yes, I agree. That is ridiculous. It seems to me obviously true that in their eagerness to protect certain people from others' aggression, many jurisdictions have produced counterproductive regulations or laws. Stand your ground laws, for example, are a very unfortunate way of trying to protect people's right to self-defense. And some cases of language policing are comparably idiotic, if not quite so harmful. Your point about flip chart is a good example, reminiscent of the case of the professor who was attacked and fired for using the word niggardly because it was ignorantly thought to be related to a racial slur. I entirely agree that assonance plus ignorance doesn't legitimize social protest. But this is just about all in your 57-minute lecture that I can reasonably agree with. Right from the outset, your language is reckless as well as vague. You use the word left as if it sufficed to disqualify any view from reasonable conversation. You never explain what it means. Libertarians are generally thought of as being on the right, but surely a good libertarian will stand up for the right of anyone to define their own gender identity and their own way of expressing it. We learn only incidentally from you, for example, that political correctness-driven oppression can consist in making a woman from a conservative culture accept that a trans woman might be using the same washroom. Well, yes. People from other cultures that perhaps practice genital mutilation, condone forms of polygamy that are deeply oppressive to women, will have trouble accepting the idea that a woman in the ladies' room was not born a lady. But she's going to have to get used to a whole lot of other things as well. Many more things will cause her discomfort in our culture. But that hardly justifies your insistence that it is more important to protect her from being shocked or uncomfortable than it is to protect the trans woman who feels deeply uncomfortable being forced to pretend she's still a man, and not infrequently faces threats of violence. And besides, don't you, quite rightly, insist that being disturbed is part of being educated? Now about a few specifics. You may be right in thinking that people are liable to look for occasions to blame others. But that psychological speculation about the motives of legislators is not a substitute for rational argument. What the C-16 bill proposes to do is increase the range of our society's tolerance and acceptance. Why does that make you so angry? You speak of basic assumptions about human nature which are ideologically motivated. But this phrase fits your own views about sex and gender perfectly. Despite conservative and Republican slogans about immemorial, traditional marriage and attitudes to sex, these attitudes and marriage have been far from universal. Some cultures have recognized intersex individuals, such as hijras in India. And myths, of which I know very little but you know a great deal, also incorporate the idea of gender transition, as in the case of Tiresias who experienced both being a man and being a woman. The first contemporary trans woman I know of is Jan Morris. She wrote a book called Conundrum, and she writes in it about the profound difference that it made in how other people treated her when she presented herself as a woman. After having been a macho journalist who'd covered the first conquest of Everest. What exactly is your objection to the demand by the many people who have more recently followed in the footsteps of Jan Morris for the elementary respect that you expect to be shown when you yourself present yourself as a man, as a professor, as a psychologist, entitled to boast of his knowledge of totalitarian mentality? What exactly is it that you can't bring yourself to accept? New pronouns? And, by the way, your old-fashioned resistance to they is ignorant as well as prejudiced. That use of it as a gender-neutral pronoun goes all the way back to Shakespeare. I know you're widely and deeply read, and so I'm astonished at the display of ignorance and illogic in your talk. Carol Tavris, Anne Fausto Sterling, Cordelia Fine, many others have shown how shabby the so-called science of sex and gender has been, ever since it proved, not much more than a century ago, that women were less intelligent, more emotional, incapable of attending university without destroying their biological potential for motherhood, bound to faint away at any moment, the weaker sex, unfit for any athletic activity more demanding than riding a side saddle on a tame horse. In one of your other videos, you make much of a study that shows that in a more highly gender egalitarian society, such as Sweden, women freely choose those professions that are traditionally designated as females. But as support for your position that gender differences are just biological, that is pathetically weak. There could be all kinds of reasons for those Swedish women's choices, such as the psychological inertia that preserves ancient conventions and prejudices in people's minds long after they've been discredited. Most Canadians now accept same-sex marriage as a fact of life, and certainly human nature shows no sign of repudiating it. In all consistency, I'm tempted to guess, from the views that you express here, that you may well think that same-sex marriage is a terrible mistake which will prove to be the end of human life and love as we know it. Personally, I would regard that as a good thing, given how miserable life and love so often prove for those who try to conform to the traditional forms of heterosexual, androcentric, monogamous love and sex. I think it's fair to say that, generally, people who reject the prevalent assumptions are actually more likely to be right than those who endorse them, especially when those assumptions are about themselves. The reason is that the default is always easier to go along with than the contrarian position. I think you agree with this. But you identify yourself as the beleaguered rebel. And the intersex and transgender or queer people and their liberal advocates, you identify as the oppressors, the tyrants, who get to define what is politically correct. You never actually say what that expression is supposed to mean. And one is rather tempted to think it refers to any form of good manners or courtesy that is intended to spare the feelings of people you disapprove of. But couldn't it be a good thing that certain expressions, racist, religious, ethnic slurs, or the sort of misogyny spouted by Donald Trump have come to be disapproved of as bad manners? Well, you say no. You say that suppressing hatred, quote, does not make it go away. It makes it go underground, where it's worse than when it is expressed. Really? You seem to be saying that hateful and hating speech should be encouraged. You write, or you say, making hate speech go away does not make hate go away. But actually, quite often it does. Societies that cultivate good manners in speech and behavior do tend to be less violent than those that give free rein to violent speech. It's not accidental that America has become more violent and seen more assaults on Muslims, LGBTQ people in the streets since Trump has been setting the national example of unrestrained abuse. Similarly, the anti-immigrant rhetoric of the Brexit advocates has coincided with a marked increase in random attacks against foreigners in Britain. Besides, your argument seems self-contradictory. I can't understand how you think that suppressing speech is likely to make people, quote, more likely to agitate for violence, unquote, since agitating for violence involves the very speech that you object to suppressing. When interests conflict, it can be difficult to decide whose interests to prioritize. Again, I don't think you disagree, but whose needs should be accommodated? Whose wants count as needs? I think that if you bothered to talk to members of the LGBTQ community, you would find that what they want reflects needs more urgent than your need not to be bothered with new pronouns. Members of sexual minorities want to be accorded simple, ordinary human respect. How is your need to be not manipulated into using a new pronoun comparable to that? Is it really you who are oppressed by a student's request to refer to them as they or jar? Or could it be that the more oppressed person is the one who's constantly made to feel like a freak because they do not feel comfortable conforming to gender stereotypes that you approve of? And by the way, if all your ancestors had been normal, you would be a single-celled organism. Everything about us that is human was first instantiated by some freak who happened to be our ancestor. You take pride in your heroic resistance at the risk of losing your job or your liberty to politically correct assumptions. But surely, in purely statistical terms, a majority of North Americans are likely to join your crusade against political correctness, starting with the 45% of the American population who delight in Donald Trump's attacks on minorities, on women, on LGBTQ persons. So despite your heroic posturing, you are actually a mouthpiece for bigots whose views, I hope, you would disavow. Among all those two common beliefs to which you lend your professional authority is the very idea that there is a uniform human nature which specifically dictates a rigid, universal, male-female dichotomy. But, as you ought to know, despite the fact that, in strictly reproductive terms, the mammalian sex system is, indeed, binary, The idea that this extends to gender and sexual orientation is actually incompatible with the mechanism of evolution. The fundamental principle of life is diversity, without which no natural selection could occur. Even when some trait is favored as adaptive, it is sometimes adaptive only providing that other individuals don't all have it. This is called frequency-dependent fitness. I'm quite sure you know about it. For example, it is adaptive to be a male, only if there are lots of females around and not too many males. And conversely, lots of traits are like that. As an expert in personality theory, you know that if a personality trait became near universal, that would probably occasion the spread of its opposite. So, it's entirely normal in the living world for a trait to be less than universal. That could be why, while it is indeed true, as you stress, that most people are heterosexual, a biological perspective would predict that some would not be, that some would be homosexual or bisexual or pansexual. Even being male or being female are just alternative strategies for reproduction, but that leaves all other traits associated with sex, including those we call gender, quite free to vary a great deal. A system of reproduction could remain largely binary, though no doubt technology will enable some same-sex couples fairly soon to combine their DNA in novel fashions. But there's no reason whatever why all the other things that have been associated with gender have to stay the same. The crucial fact of logic that you seem to miss is that statistics about biological sex differences prove absolutely nothing about any individual person. Many dimensions have been associated with sex differences: muscular strength, height, mathematical ability, verbal fluency, toy preferences, stamina, empathy, and all your favorite stereotypes. In every case, what you get is a bimodal distribution, a shift in the mode or top of the bell curve. But in every such distribution, except the very few that involve actual reproductive functions, there's a large area of overlap. What that means is that for practically any male on any given dimension, there will be some woman who ranks further on the masculine side of that dimension than he does. Similarly, for any female, there'll be some man who's more feminine on that dimension than she is. So, merely knowing that someone is male or female can't possibly justify treating that person as if she were or he were simply typical of his or her birth sex. That is the source of the profound injustice that is committed every time an individual is judged to deserve a certain treatment on the basis of their being a man or a woman at birth. The same goes for intersex, where your misuse of statistics is even more egregious. You say that there are only very few genuine intersex people. Estimates of that number vary from 1.7% by Anne Fausto Sterling to 0.02% from Leonard Sachs, who's Fausto Sterling's most vocal critic, and uses far more restrictive criteria. But why should the number matter? Your conclusion that because there are few, therefore they virtually don't exist, is preposterous. Would you say that if there were only 100,000 black people in America, it would be quite okay to keep discriminating against them? After all, you say, you can only make laws that apply generally. You can't take care of every exception. By this logic, you could argue that if there are not too many Jews in a society, it's perfectly okay to deny them some rights. If they're just 0.02% of genuinely intersex people, as Leonard Sachs claims, that still makes 80,000 genuine intersex people in North America. Is their minority status really enough to justify discriminating against them in all the ways that Bill C-16 is intended to prevent? Australians, Indians, and Germans can, or soon will be able to, ask to be recognized as neither male nor female by checking a third box on their passport applications. Is that really such a terrible affront to Jordan Peterson's undoubted masculinity? In short, Jordan, I am deeply disappointed at the cavalier way in which you ride roughshod over fact and logic. You're quite right to say that your freedom of speech entitles you to express yourself as you please on these matters or any others. But your apparent ignorance of the vast literature attesting to the reality and the diversity of non-standard forms of sex, gender, and sexual expression and orientation is really distressing. It undermines the authority that you derive from your professorial chair. You say at one point that you merely believe these things, but you don't necessarily believe that what you're saying is true. Well, it doesn't come off that way. Quite frankly, it comes over as a bully, and your lecture comes over as a rant, which will obscure your few legitimate criticisms of Bill C-16. Looking at that, you spend quite a bit of time complaining that the bill's definition of gender identity is badly written. But actually there's nothing wrong with it at all. The fact that you don't know how that could be an alternative to male and female displays nothing more than your failure of imagination, a shocking failure in a professional therapist. Of course, as I've said, reproductively speaking, our species is binary. There are only two sexes for the purposes of reproduction. But does that mean that those whose equipment is differently configured, and who may therefore not be even able to reproduce, don't count as human? Your claim that there is no upside to recognizing people's profound experience of gender identity or gender dysphoria is insensitive to a degree I would not have supposed you capable of. Your claim that people who feel they're prepared to undergo enormous suffering to correct their gender dysphoria really don't exist is hard to sympathize with or understand unless one posits some sort of psychological trouble of your own, which is responsible for such an egregious lack of empathy. And your petulant refusal to consider expanding your vocabulary of pronouns is perplexing. Do you really also refuse to use the salutation Ms., for example, on the ground that you really need to know, given the facts of human nature, whether a woman is married or not? It's only a few decades ago that it took a big struggle to get people to use Ms. instead of Mrs. or Miss. Now, I dare say, even you sometimes use Ms. Why is it so offensive to you that someone should want not to be slotted into a stereotype of gender as the very essence of their being, the first thing you have to know about them and allude to when you refer to them? To them, a minimal expression of respect makes the difference between feeling accepted as fully human and being regarded as a freak. But all is asked of you is the small effort to get used to a new pronoun. But apparently you regard it as a legitimate trigger for furious resistance against a murderous ideology. These are your words. Really? A murderous ideology. Please, Jordan, come to your senses.